We have three terrific guests tonight, and with our three experts, we are going to cover in an hour. We may go till 6:45, but we are going to cover a brief history of voting rights in America. We're going to talk about the contemporary state of voting rights. What legislation is there? What are the challenges that still exist? And we're going to talk about the history of voting rights in North Carolina specifically, since that is the birthplace of the Reimagining America Project. And it's one of the challenged states in our country when it comes to voting rights and to racist systems and to a history of racial segregation and oppression. So joining me tonight, I'm going to introduce each guest before I ask them a question to start our conversation off and looking at our history. I'll introduce them one at a time, but first I want to tell you all their names and their affiliations. We have with us tonight Dr. Hilary Green with the University of Alabama. We have Professor Claude Clegg with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I will add that Dr. Green also attended Chapel Hill. And finally, we have Mr. Robert Wilson, who has been an Assistant Secretary of State for many years in North Carolina, very close to what goes on with voting procedures, processes, and challenges. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Hilary Green. Dr. Hilary Green is the co-program director of the African American Studies program with a partial appointment in American Studies at the University of Alabama. She earned her BA in history with a minor in African Studies and pre-healing arts from Franklin and Marshall College, MA in history from Tufts University, and her PhD from UNC Chapel Hill. Her research and teaching interests include the intersection of race, class, and gender, and African American history, the American Civil War, Reconstruction, Civil War memory, the U.S. South, 19th century America, and the Black Atlantic. Wow, you are really working right in the middle of all the challenges we're facing. So we're going to start with you because I'd love to have you give us a brief overview of the history of voting rights in America. We know that this country did not start with universal suffrage. We know that it has been discriminatory from the beginning, and universal suffrage is a long time in coming. Some think that we're still not there. So I will turn it over to you to give us that brief history. Welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for allowing me to talk about the history of voting rights. And something that I remind my students all the time when we say we, the people of the United States, in order to have a more perfect union. And who were the people? White men of property. And that really talks about how over time different groups expanded the people to include those who were never intended to be included in as voters, as politicians, and the like. And so the history of voting rights really is really nice to look at if you look at the Black experience and Black voters in particular. There's a lot of things that happen to African Americans. You can then trace out other groups over time in which it is something where the state determines really who got vote rather than the federal government. So from the founding of the country to about the 1830s and 40s, Black men in some states could vote. But over the 1830s and 40s, Black men, where property restrictions and property qualifications were removed to enlarge the franchise, they were kept for African American men. In other states, they lost the vote altogether. So we have this large portion, then a shrinkage. It's Reconstruction that we've been really talking about that expansion and what we really think about universal suffrage. And that's where we look at the South, and then where I'm at in the University of Alabama, and I know also include North Carolina in this, because the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 that put the former Confederate states into military districts for the first time expanded the franchise to Black Southern men, because they were registered to vote, to draft new state constitutions, but they can also run for office. So Black Southern men, for the most part, before even Black men in Pennsylvania and others had the right to vote and could vote in the 1868 election. The passage of the 14th Amendment should have given Black men and other minority groups the right to vote, but it doesn't happen. And it's the election violence around the 1868 elections that gets Congress to think about the 15th Amendment. At this time, the 15th Amendment is then again restricted to Black men. Women are not considered in this, and that really causes a frustration and a coalition of people agitating for the right to vote. And in the 15th Amendment is there, this is where violence and the courts start to intervene and whittle away what these rights are. The Supreme Court in the United States versus Reese really in 1876 narrowly construes what even the 15th Amendment applies to for Black men, but it gets a sense of who can vote and who can't, and the role of the courts for either advancing Black political power and rights to franchise and the expansion to others, but also limiting. And it's really where we see the restriction, even those Reconstruction gains whittled down in 1890 to 1908 with the passage of the new state constitutions, but also other legislative acts restricting African-American voting. And in states like mine, I'm in Alabama, the 1901 Constitution, when they were debating the law in Montgomery, right near where the opening of Dexter Church is, where we saw in the opening, Black disenfranchisement and attacks on Black education went hand in hand, because Reconstruction was so successful with Black politicians and very much enfranchised African-American population that brings democracy, small d, across the nation and really expanded the people. And so those Jim Crow constitutions is really where we're getting back to the voter suppression tactics of today, because it's the legacy of those constitutions and the direct and indirect means with the literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and the like that we're seeing starting to be put in place. But when you think about it generational wise, it's the grandparents, great grandparents of the people in the office today who are going back to the good old days of their white ancestors. And that means certain people can vote, but not everyone. And some of those early challenges, African-Americans challenged and got some wins. Gwynn versus United States overturns the constitutionality of the grandfather clause. So the Supreme Court intervenes there. That went too far. But it's not until like 1944, Smith versus Allwright, that gets rid of the all-white primary. So few African-Americans who could still keep their vote, they're limited to how they can vote and mobilize their power. To the removal of the poll tax with the 24th Amendment, but also the expansion of the women with the 19th Amendment. So we're starting to see some expansions for some people, but race is going to be very much a key, and who can vote, who can't. Expansion of whiteness and white voter participation is going to increase. And those African Americans and other racial minorities, including Asian Americans, Mexican Americans, and other groups not labeled as white, will be affected too. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the hallmark that we think about the classical civil rights movement, is very much key, but also from the beginning, the groundwork to where we are today, it's also laid out in very clear terms by chipping away what is federal protections, trying to say in the state like Alabama and North Carolina, hey, we've done everything, we should no longer be under these federal mandates. So it's not surprising in 2013, Shelby County versus Holder, Shelby County, Alabama. I live in Jefferson County, it's the neighboring county. Alabama, again, able to get a Supreme Court victory, pretty much neutralizing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it's that post-Shelby decision world that I think is where we are now. And being in Alabama, voter ID bills, but then Senator Jeff Sessions, before he goes into the administration of the last president, closed down DMVs. And if you're in a majority rural Black Belt community and there's no public transportation, having DMVs closed where you can't get your free ID, some of those same tactics of the civil rights movement had to come in play, where people literally drive people and carpool so people can get an ID to vote. Same thing with closing down polling stations and majority Black areas, majority minority areas. have their polling stations closed, and sometimes hours, so we're seeing the long lines. Again, making it difficult for people to vote. So we don't have literacy tests anymore. We don't have poll taxes anymore, but we have other indirect means building on that legacy of those Jim Crow racial restrictions. We also have gerrymandering and machine-based redistricting. But one of the things that comes back to is narrowing down Black political power, Black and minority liberty power, and these coalitions to push against what was there and the sense of what is universal suffrage. And what other groups have fought for and attained is now being chipped away in a way that we're going back to an era of a not so distant past, but one where I think the civil rights movement and the people still alive and the monuments of King can still help us in the present to draw upon that legacy in order to how to combat this. And that means we need the courts, we need grassroots, but we also need to make sure that we have people go into the polls and making sure they can vote and have their IDs. We can do this if we go from the ground up and in the legal system and learn from that past. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Green. I know I gave you an impossible task of, 200 years of voting history in 10 minutes, and you did it. So thanks so much. And boy, I have some questions about what you said, but I'm gonna go through each of our presentations, and then we'll have a discussion and some, delving into some more of the items that you mentioned, because there's quite a bit in there. There's quite a bit of history that people who look like me, a lot of white people, are still learning. Things that we didn't hear in school about voter suppression, about uprisings against people of color voting. So thanks so much for that.